Hi everyone. We are going to continue our lesson regarding the compounds being ionic or molecular and how we can count atoms. So when I was going through the covalent and the ionic bonding, I showed you formulas such as CH4, Cl2, CO2. How about possibly CaF2? Quick check. Which of these are molecular and which of these are ionic compounds? So let's see. Carbon, nonmetal. Hydrogen, nonmetal. Molecular. Chlorine, 2 nonmetals. Molecular compound. CO2, 2 nonmetals. Molecular compound. CaF2 is a metal and a nonmetal, and that is an ionic compound. So what do these numbers mean when we have chemical formulas? A subscript number is only referring to the element before it. So in this case for CO2, it is telling us we have 1 carbon atom and 2 oxygen atoms. But when we write it in a formula, since there's 2 oxygen, we put a subscript 2. In this case, we have 1 calcium atom and 2 fluorine atoms. Here, 1 carbon, 4 hydrogen. Okay, so that is how you count atoms in that way. But what if I gave you something like this? 4. K2CrO4. Ugh. Looks a little frightening. Okay, so we have potassium, chromium, and oxygen. Now in this case, I ask you, how many calcium atoms do we have? How many chromium atoms do we have? And how many oxygen atoms do we have? The 4 that comes before the entire formula applies to each and every atom in the formula. And I'll show you how. So the 4 applies to the potassium. It applies to the chromium, and it applies to the oxygen. So math. Let's do our calculations. We have 4 compounds of K2CrO4. We'll go through the namings a little bit later as to what you would actually call this. So we have 4 of these compounds. And in this case, it's an ionic compound. We have 4 of these ionic compounds. I'm going to do it in a very long way just for the first time so that you guys can understand how it works. So we have 4 of this entire compound, which means, write it down 4 times. Okay, that's what it means to say 4 K2CrO4. It's actually 4 of the same compound. Now, how many potassium atoms do we have? In this one compound, we have 2 potassium. We have 2 potassium here, 2 potassium here, and 2 potassium here. 2, 4, 6, 8. We have 8 potassium atoms. How about chromium? 1, 2, 3, 4. So we have 4 chromium. How many oxygen do we have? Well, each compound has 4. So it's 4 plus 4 plus 4 plus 4. We have 16 oxygen atoms. Now, instead of writing this all out 4 times, because what if I gave you a number like 23? Are you going to write it out 23 times? The easiest way to calculate the number of atoms is to multiply the number 4 with the subscripts. When there is no subscript after an element, it usually means that it's 1. But we don't put the 1 because it's known. So that's why we don't put it there. But you assume that there's 1. So it would be a lot easier for us to calculate it if we said, how many potassium do we have? Well, it's 4 times 2, that gives us 8. 4 times 1 gives us 4. And 4 times 4 gives us 16 oxygen. That makes it a lot easier to count atoms. I'm going to give you a more complicated one, which probably is going to be the most complicated you're going to see, at least for this class. So, what if I gave you this wonderful formula? Again, this is ionic, but woohoo! Wow, look at that. There's parentheses. I don't know if you've seen that before, at least in a formula. So what does it mean? So let's just look at this part right here, okay? So let's just take this and focus on it. So we have NH4 between parentheses and then a 2. That means we have 2 NH4. Okay, so that's telling us we have 2 of this compound, NH4. So if I, just in this part, just in this section, if I asked you how many nitrogen do you have, you would take the 2 and multiply it by each subscript. So just here, you would say, well, I have 2 nitrogen and I have 8 hydrogen. So when you see these parentheses around a compound, it is saying that you have 2 of this compound, because NH4 is a compound in itself. Okay? So now that you know this, let's look at the compound in its entirety. So I'm going to ask you, well, how many nitrogen atoms do I have? How many hydrogen? How many chromium? And how many oxygen? Let's do the chromium and the oxygen first, just because there's no parentheses involved with them and they're a lot easier to do. So each compound has 2 chromium in them, but I have 3. So remember I told you the best way to solve that, instead of writing this all out 3 times, is to take the 3 and multiply it by 2. So that means you would get 6 chromium. You do the same thing with the 3 and the 7, and then that means you have 21 oxygens. Now let's look at the nitrogen and the hydrogen. What you must do first is count how many nitrogen there are in each compound of NH4 to Cr2O7. So there are 2 nitrogen in each compound, but you have 3 of those compounds. So that's going to give you 6. So you take 2. So imagine this was a 1. Remember, we say if there's no subscripts, you take it as a 1. You have to take 2 times 1 times 3 to give you 6. For hydrogen, you do the same thing. you take the 4 times 2, and then you multiply that by 3. So that gives you 24 hydrogen. Okay, so you always should do inside the parentheses first, do that multiplication, then multiply it by the 3. Okay, so each compound has 2 nitrogen, but you have 3 of them. That's why you have 6 nitrogen. Each compound here has 8 hydrogen, but you have 3 of them. That's why you have 24. Do not confuse yourselves when you get such a big formula like this. Do it step by step. And worst case scenario, if you are very stuck, write the formula out 3 times, like I wrote here, and then count. If you find that you are getting stuck, it is possible to do it the long way just to ensure that you get the number correct. But I strongly suggest learning how to do it this way, because if I was to give you a much longer formula, doing it the long way can be extremely difficult and you'll be more prone to make mistakes that way.